I'm getting it. Great. Wonderful. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Back to the Basics, review of CDBG-DR fundamentals this morning. My name is Adrienne Duncan. I work for Civics. I'm a TA provider for HUD, along with, hi, I'm Paula Landis, also with Civics, and also providing TA through HUD. We will be chatting with you all this morning to discuss really the basic CDBG-DR fundamentals. I think one item to note as we talk about this session, as you heard from Calvin earlier this morning, the 3 days you're really going to build upon the fundamentals and then layer in some very specific sessions as we get into Wednesday and Thursday. And so for many times we do CDBG-DR 101, or the fundamentals, over a period of 3 or 4 days, right? There's so much to really unpack. And we are all together for 45 minutes this morning before we go into Q&A. So that means that the level of information we're going to talk about this morning is pretty high level. Really talking about connecting the changes that you look for when you're coming from the annual program into DR. And then we're also going to highlight some of those new waivers, alternative requirements, details that have come in with the consolidated notice. So to highlight some of those changes. So really think of this just as it is, session 1, first day, that we're really going to go through those basics and really talk about the fundamental pieces. And then at each point, we'll let you know, hey, we're giving you, 2 slides on duplication of benefits. But remember, on Thursday, there's a whole hour really dedicated to that. So think about this really as that foundational learning block for the entire rest of the clinic. So for our agenda this morning, we will just really, first of all, talk about what sets DR apart, right? Other than a disaster, right? There's some reason that you all are here to learn about disaster recovery. Your community has been impacted by a disaster. So really, how does that then take the annual program and what changes are we looking at to make sure that you can adapt and you can meet the needs of your community to recover from the disaster? And then we will go into some tools for programming your DR funds, really talking about, what are those changes on your CDBG-DR eligible activities? How do you have a little bit more flexibility? There's a reason that HUD chooses CDBG funds in a disaster. They are the most flexible dollars that they have and can really provide that specific, needs, meet your needs of your community. We will also talk about the CDBG-DR mitigation set aside that's new from your in the consolidated notice, that 15%, and talk about some ways that you can use it, some best practices as everyone is really folding that into their action plans and their programming. We will touch on duplication of benefits, and then we'll wrap up with some questions and answers. So a lot of real basic fundamentals this morning, and I think we will be calculating for those on the WebEx, your Q&A in the chat, and then we'll have a good little Q&A session at the end for everyone in the room. So with that, we are excited to get started. All right, guys. So kicking things off, again, like Adrienne said, with a very high-level program overview. What is CDBG-DR? So hopefully most of you are familiar with this, but always great to reorient ourselves, right, to the funding source that we're tackling here. DR funds are provided as a special appropriation by Congress. They're certainly not guaranteed, but also a critical part of long-term recovery following a presidentially declared disaster. Like Adrienne said, we use CDBG funds for disaster recovery because they are a flexible set of funds. And then, of course, we're going to talk about this in future slides, but HUD layers in additional waivers to add to that flexibility. So you as the grantee can truly use them to carry out a wide range of activities to meet the unmet needs of your communities. Just like the annual program, DR funds prioritize low and moderate income persons and geographies, right? So we've got that overall benefit requirement of 70% LMI. And we're going to talk about that some more a little later in the presentation. It also takes into account damage estimates in order to determine each allocation. And you can dig into the Federal Register notice, right, to understand how HUD took that data from each disaster and determined how the appropriation will get divvied up into each allocation. And another key part, right, of DR funds is that 80% of the allocation that you receive has to be spent within that HUD identified most impacted and distressed area. And I think just building upon what Tennille said this morning, I know we have a good amount in the 2022 class of local governments. So when we talk about the mid may be your entire county, your entire jurisdiction. For state governments, it may look a little bit different, right? That 80% is going to be in different areas. So really understanding where your disaster is and what your allocation looks like and how it's allocated in your Federal Register notice. So in terms of, again, very high level, the process that DR funds go through to reach you, the grantee, they start with Congress approving that appropriation. Then the responsibility shifts over to HUD, right? So HUD does the calculations to determine each allocation, and they use the Federal Register notice to announce an allocation. As I'm sure all of you guys are aware of at this point, but always helpful to remember, your Federal Register notice is your guidebook, right? It provides you with all the rules and regulations that dictate the funds that you're receiving. And like Adrian said, we're going to dig in a little bit to the consolidated notice in this presentation and how it has shifted some things. For those of y'all that have received prior allocations, how the consolidated notice may change some things that you're familiar with from the past. Once that Federal Register notice comes out, the responsibility moves to you, the grantee. And the session after this, the DR Basics Round 2, is going to really highlight the process when it lands in your court, right? Developing and submitting your financial certifications, your implementation plan to HUD, laying out your action plan, getting that submitted to HUD, and then ultimately administering your projects and programs, right, to address your recovery and mitigation needs. So wherever you guys fall in that timeline, we're going to dig into some, high-level basics here, and then over the course of the next 2 days, you'll get more and more detail. Great. So I think just looking around the room and having seen some familiar faces, I know we have a group, we have grantees that are falling under the consolidated notice. So that is our 2020, 2021, 2022 class. And then those that are maybe some DR veterans that have older grants, 2005, 2008, 2013, right? All of those really, that means that what we have is we have different Federal Register notices. If you explored the HUD the resources page and the Federal Register notice page that has everything going back, all the way to 2001, everyone has just a couple of nuances. And so as Tennille mentioned this morning, really focusing on that consistent guidance and laying that groundwork through the Office of Disaster Recovery. That's what we're seeing as a start in the consolidated notice. So that consolidated notice really outlines all of the process, the procedures, timelines, and everything that you can expect to see continuously over in future disasters, right? Everything's going to come back to that consolidated notice. So really understanding that, especially if you're a new grantee, to really understand those basics, that is going to be your fundamentals. And then we'll get, the allocation announcement notice, as HUD loves a good acronym, the AAN, I think as it is going to go by, that'll really focus in on those specific allocations. I know the 2022 class is waiting for theirs that will imminently drop, and that really, starts all your timelines and all of your triggers. But really looking at that and becoming familiar with it is going to be key, because even if you are a seasoned veteran grantee, some of the changes that are in the consolidated notice are just a little bit nuanced, right? Something may have been you may do this. Now it's you shall do this, right? It's requirements versus, recommendations. So those changes are really critical in creating, not only developing a compliant action plan process that can move through to be approved, but also the fundamentals of your programs, so that those are really, outlined well in your action plan, and you're able to move from action plan to implementation in a shorter timeline. So we're going to keep moving. Like, what sets CDBG-DR apart from everything else, right? You could go back to 570 and read the annual requirements and be like, okay, I get it. I understand CDBG. That is your basics. And then everything else, you really start to build upon with the disaster recovery allocations and the, and the program. So the first and quite the most obvious, at some point, is that all DR activities must be tied to the disaster covered in the allocation in the Federal Register notice, right? That's tied to your FEMA disaster declarations. And that seems really like, especially for some of the newer grantees, like, yeah, that happened last year. Obviously, what we're going to do is tied to the disaster. However, if you remember, you look at it, and as Tennille said this morning, you've got grantees. I think she highlighted the 2008 class that she'd like to be closing out, right? So think about that time frame, right? And as you continue to spend those dollars, that tie to the disaster is really critical to keep in mind, right? How do you continue to tie it back to the impacts from that disaster? And so as time goes on, you have to ensure that you're keeping that tie strong to the programs, because as you know, what you initially propose in your action plan, that'll change, right? There may be some other data that comes around. There may be other needs that come up. And so really ensuring that you're looking at the notice, and you're looking at the programming, and you're constantly refreshing and looking at the data and the unmet needs to determine where your funding goes. And so, so really, how do we do that, right? Just to kind of talk through that a bit in a little bit of detail is, there's obvious, right? If we have a disaster, if it was a hurricane, if it was a fire, if it was a flood, a tornado, we have homes that are impacted, right? So you can look at housing, homes, rental housing, single family housing, multifamily housing, all of that. You've got infrastructure that may have been impacted by the disaster and partially repaired by FEMA, or, looking at larger infrastructure projects and how you make them more resilient as you rebuild them and restructure them. So thinking of it a little bit holistically, and really making sure, fundamentally, any disaster, whether it hits an entire community, a part of the community, really looking at how is that community recovering holistically? How are we looking at three big factors: housing, economic development, or the economy? Do we have a grocery store? Do we have stores, or people going to want to come back to live here? And then do we have the roads and the infrastructure that will make it safe for them to be there? So thinking about it in those three elements, one community won't recover without all three of these. And then looking at the public services aspect. Is there a service that's needed in the area? So really thinking about that. And I think at times, you document that disaster, but really making, and you can see a very specific one-to-one tie back, but making sure that as you look at the action plan, as you do your community engagement and work with stakeholders, you really understand how are we looking at this as a holistic recovery for our community. And so waivers and alternative requirements. I think you will hear this conversation throughout the next 3 days of different waivers and alternative requirements that HUD has also set up. I know that there are quite a few individual TA sessions really related to what are those waivers, what are the alternative requirements, what you may need to ask. And I think that one thing we've always encouraged grantees, and HUD does, as you're looking at your data, as you're in that original action plan writing, stakeholder investment, you're gathering all of that information to understand what it's going to take for your community to recover. really think about initiating some of those waiver requests early to HUD, to really come to them and say, okay, we understand what's in the Federal Register notice. We understand what the requirement is. And our community has a unique situation that we need to address in a waiver or an alternative requirement. And that approach really allows you to make the case for your community and for the needs that you all have in that community. And it may be something that comes along later in the process as you understand and other additional unmet needs unfold. And it may be something that comes on the beginning of the process. And I think this is where it's really important to have a great relationship with your HUD field office or your reps to understand what are those needs and how do you get there. Because the goal of everyone is for the communities to recover. And so we need to make sure that we are asking the right questions and we're putting together programs that really work for your community. I think one thing that, you'll hear, every disaster is different, 100%, whether it's a hurricane, a flood, all of them are different. You're also seeing different types of disasters, right? We now look at water disasters. If we look at flooding or looking at a hurricane, we're looking at, wind disasters, and we're looking at tornado impacts. And then we're looking at fire disasters. All really have very different needs to enhance that community to recover, right? And so as you as the grantees are really continuing to teach HUD about the different disasters that are coming and impacting your communities, you have the opportunity to say, hey, we may need something a little bit different here because we're looking at, recovery. One thing I know as we have talked about really the water-based versus a fire-based disaster. When a water-based disaster, you look at a lot of rehab of homes. In a fire-based disaster, you're looking at a lot of reconstruction of homes. So looking at the requirements that are in the Federal Register notice around rehabbing versus reconstruction, those have different impacts based on the disaster. So really understanding those and being, and starting that conversation early and gathering the data to make sure that you're coming to HUD with a waiver, or hey, we have this problem and we think we know how to fix it. Can we look at a different waiver if we went this path or that path, and working through what makes the most sense. The one thing too, just, within parameters, right? HUD, there's certain things HUD can't waive. And you also have to ensure that we're not conflicting with big cross-cutting pieces, FHEO, environmental laws, labor standards. All of those things are really important. So thinking of it in the confines of the regulations and what you can change. All right, so now we're going to dig a little deeper into how the requirements laid out by HUD can really be framed as your resources, right, for programming and understanding how you're going to move forward with your allocation to address the recovery needs of your community. So I think first it's critical to understand, which any veterans in the room know, and any new folks I think will learn quickly, is that no CDBG-DR allocation is going to meet every need, right? Unfortunately, an allocation is never going to make us whole. So the key and WAL's responsibility, right, at this early phase when you're figuring out how you're going to take this allocation and program it to meet the needs of your recovery, is to understand, looking at your data, right, where those needs lie, like Adrian said, in those big buckets: housing, infrastructure, economic development, these key pieces that are necessary for bringing communities back, right, and having people reinvest in the places that they live. And then based on the data of how your impacts fell, how are you going to divvy up these dollars into programs and projects that will meet those needs? I think a really important piece of the consolidated notice to think through here as well, when you're at that very early stage of programming those dollars, is the emphasis on not just putting back what was there, right? But incorporating mitigation and resilience factors into your housing projects, into your infrastructure improvements, into those economic development opportunities, so that the communities that you are serving are better off and less impacted if and when the next disaster hits, right? So like Adrienne said, we're looking at our recovery holistically, realizing we have limited resources, right? But determining how we can best allocate those resources based on the data we have and the needs that exist. I think, like Adrienne just said, also keeping in mind always that each recovery is unique, right? Your experience is not your next door neighbors or the state, down the road. So using, again, the resources that HUD gives you, the opportunity to introduce additional waivers, the opportunity to dig in with your HUD field office to better understand the requirement, to make sure that you're using the information you have to best program the funds at your disposal. The next big piece here, right, which just discussed, but digging into a little more, is understanding your unmet need and then using your funds to address it, right? So one thing you'll talk about in the next session, as you talk about developing your action plan, is how you build out that unmet needs assessment. If you understand your unmet need, right, naturally, the way you program your dollars should fall somewhat in line with how that unmet need falls. So if you're seeing that, 80% of your housing was impacted, then naturally you want to see a majority of your allocation directed towards housing recovery programs, right? So aligning the need with the money that you have is the direction you want to head. Of course, always understanding that you can't do it all. So providing HUD with the justification with why you want to direct funds one way or another is also critical. An interesting piece of the consolidated notice for folks that have 2020, 2021, or 2022 grants is that you can take funds from future or prior allocations, assuming that you have overlapping MIDs, right? So if you have a 2017 disaster and a 2020 disaster allocation, you've got a MID that overlaps and you have similar unmet needs in that MID, you can use your funds interchangeably to address those needs, as long as you are following the rules and regulations, the Federal Register notice that aligns with the funding source that you're using. So if you've got the 2017 MID, the 2020 MID, the unmet needs that overlap, and you decide to use your 2017 allocation to address that particular need, then you look towards your 2017 Federal Register notice and you follow those rules, right? But I think this is a great example of how HUD is incorporating added flexibility into how you use these dollars, with the understanding, right, like Tennille said, that disasters have been hitting us for a long time and they don't seem to be going anywhere fast. So seeing how you can consolidate and utilize those resources in a focused manner to hopefully create some changes that will make you stronger in the future is a great opportunity that we haven't seen in the past.
I would also say, if this is a path that you're considering, or you have multiple disasters and MIDs that overlap, so a critical point is to ensure that this is something that your financial department, and as you've set up these grants, like all of this is set up together, right? Because this is a very technical piece, right, that allows you some really great flexibility to be able to support that MID that has been repeatedly impacted by disasters. But it is also, there's some technicalities here, and making sure that you're setting up everything correct in the front end is going to be critical to your success long term. All right, so another resource that provides us to help guide us in programming our funds is the requirement that all eligible activities have to meet a national objective. So hopefully y'all are familiar with this. We're gonna go into LMI and urgent need a little bit today. Clearly, we could dig into these a whole lot more, but just some high level thoughts around how you use this requirement, right, to determine where your dollars fall. Of course, Slim and Blight is our third national objective. It's rarely used in the DR space, so we're not going to dig into it too much here. But if you have questions around something like those can certainly be addressed later. So a big change that we see in the consolidated notice is around urgent need. And I think instead of urgent need just as a national objective to replace projects that aren't going to meet LMI, HUD really wants to see that the projects that you are targeting with the urgent need national objective are addressing an urgent need within a community. And I think urgency, right, tends to have a time clock attached to it, because as time goes on, if an issue is really urgent, then you're probably going to find a way to address it. So what HUD has introduced is within your action plan submission, right, you need to identify within 36 months of your allocation announcement notice which programs are going to be the urgent need national objective. And it's not just stating, hey, we're going to do this program, this infrastructure program, and it's going to be urgent need. You need to explain how the activity that you're funding is going to respond to an urgency within your community, right? That was created by the disaster. So I think a helpful example that we were talking about earlier would be a community that's hit by a disaster that loses its grocery store, right? The grocery store is impacted beyond functioning. The community doesn't necessarily meet the LMI threshold, right? 51% of the community is not LMI, but perhaps it's a vulnerable community, more vulnerable by the fact that these people don't have access to nutritious food. Pulling in the urgent need national objective to say it's critical for this community to rebound, for folks to come back here, for them to have a grocery store access. So through our program, we are going to bring this grocery store back, right? Bring it back into commerce. So folks have that access and they have a reason to come back. Also related to LMI. So of course, LMI, we've got different factors of LMI that your various programs can hit. We've got LMI area benefit, we have LMI housing, LMI jobs, and depending on the programs that y'all are designing, we're going to want to set them up so they target various aspects, right, of the LMI national objective. At the higher level, you have the LMI overall benefit for your overall grant. So what HUD wants to see is overall, across all programs and projects, that 70% of your allocation is being used to benefit LMI persons. Like Adrienne said earlier, we're all different. All of our communities are different. And disasters, of course, don't pick and choose who they hit us all. But I think what's understood, right, studies have shown us, is that LMI individuals are historically or impacted by disasters because they're less able to prepare and less able to recover. So that's why, right, overall, we want to be directing our dollars towards those populations to ensure that they're in better shape in the next disaster. So we hopefully have less that we need to address. But if your overall needs aren't falling within this LMI overall benefit, there are opportunities to adjust that percentage in coordination, of course, with HUD. But that's also a process that you want to plan for. So part of this initial phase of determining what you're going to do, right, is understanding who your communities are, where they fall within these LMI thresholds, what their needs are, and then if adjustments need to be made, it's on you to make that justification to HUD to explain these are our needs, right? This is how we are going to meet the needs of our LMI communities, but then these are our outstanding needs. And as a result, perhaps we need an adjustment to that overall benefit so we can have that holistic approach to our recovery. Keeping in mind all the while, right, based on our last slide, you've got that 36 months for incorporating urgent need into your programming. So looking at this big picture, not through a silo, thinking about how all your programs and projects connect and how these national objectives play into one another, right? You want to incorporate that approach to HUD to say, okay, we know who we're addressing. We know what our LMI needs are. We know what our community statistics are, right? And this is how we're going to balance our projects and programs across our national objectives to make sure that we have the most comprehensive recovery that we can with the allocation we have access to. And I think as we move into talking about eligible activities and how this all really connects, also thinking about, for many of you, there may be one disaster and you receive a supplemental, right? You receive 2 grants. And so what we're talking about when we talk about that overall benefit, right? That is per grant that comes to you, right? So per allocation. So if you have 2 and you have one grant and then a supplemental, you're looking at those separately. I think that's a really big piece, especially as some of the newer classes. When you come in, you've got an allocation that's coming through the 2020 class, right? And that potentially maybe more. There may be a supplemental that comes in. You look at those separately. So it is really, really critical as you're setting up your programs and setting up your grant and your action plan, that you're looking at them, you're balancing and you're looking at them holistically between, your two grants or your 2 child grants, as you'll learn that they'll be called. So really making sure that you're thinking of, hey, okay, how are we looking at grant by grant, and really involving, that financial management, data management, reporting person from day one. I think we'll talk about this a lot when we get into the second session this morning about the action plan and certifications. But all of this, we say, right, 36 months, 3 years on your urgent need national objective. Looking at those, setting up the programs, what you're seeing is a really important emphasis on setting these items up in your action plan and building off of them, right? So you've got 3 years to make sure, okay, have we addressed all of the urgent need that we're looking at? Have we also set these up to understand where we are in our overall benefit and how we're focusing our funds to benefit those low to moderate income communities? And it is really critical to have your finance data management person with you every step of the way, because all of this is ultimately tied back to the percentage of funds, right? So they're managing that and setting it up on the front end is so much easier and really critical to that process. So just thinking about that as you begin, especially for the newer grantees, as you're really beginning that process, that seems really overwhelming, but the data person and the finance person is so critical to make sure that you have a good fundamental infrastructure for it, to make sure that it will work as you continue to implement your grants. So we just talked about, there's 3 big pieces, right? We talked about the tie to the disaster. We talked about the national objectives. And now we're going to talk about eligible activities. And we're not going to spend the next, 20 to 15 minutes talking about the basic CDBG eligible activities. Those are available. You can look at them and read through them in Part 570. What we're going to talk about is just what changes in the consolidated notice. And so for everyone, generally speaking, and maybe we'll have a quick show of hands from the audience that's in here, is who has operated on the annual program before they come into the DR world? A show of quick hands. So it's okay, a good bit of you. So what we're going to talk about this morning, this will be really helpful for you. And it's going to also be like, oh, wow, this is a little bit of a change. So what we think about is how, we look at the annual program as the base, and then we're able to have some changes and some flexibility. So especially for those of you that have operated in the annual program, or your department operates the annual program, this is really helpful to think through, because this is going to be a change for everyone, right? As we talk about some of these items you can do. And so you may hear, when you go back, we can't do this, but yes, you can in DR. And so really trying to help that conversation.
And the biggest, to me, the biggest one that is the fundamental is really being able to build new construction housing, right? You rehab in the annual program, you do a great job. You have an annual rehab program that's been working great. Well, now you can build new housing. And remember, you're tying it back to disaster, that housing that's impacted, but you have the ability to build that new housing, which is really critical. The second piece is elevation, right? Elevation is critical in recovering your house, recovering your homes, particularly when we're talking about water-based disasters, right? We're looking at making sure that we're meeting those critical requirements when we're rehabbing or reconstructing a home, right? There may be a situation where you're rehabbing the home, but then you also need to elevate given where the floodplain, where it is in the floodplain. Or you're looking at building new homes and you're determining, hey, we have to base it based on the floodplain. What are we building? How are we elevating? How are we looking to make these homes more resilient? How are we looking to not just recover from this disaster, but be prepared for future disasters? So the second is building standards. And I know I think there's a whole session on construction standards and building standards and the importance of it as we look at rehab, look at disaster recovery and repairing homes or reconstructing homes. And in the annual program, you're doing that rehab to code, right? You're doing that rehab based on what is needed. In disaster recovery, we're saying, okay, well, there was a reason these homes were vulnerable, right? Based on the disaster. So we have to meet those new codes. So we're looking at green and resilient standards along with minimum building standards. This also is an opportunity for you to go back to your local, to your, other departments and say, hey, look, we have a change. We're going to be building to different standards here. And how do we all work together to make sure this happens, right? They're still going to have to approve all those permits and make sure everything's correct. So this is really a joint connection and a joint venture between your other departments too. So educating them, bringing them in. Are they incorporating green building standards in other aspects? Do they know about this? All of that, sometimes if those building inspectors, they've been around, they know exactly what they're doing to meet your standards that are set in your community. And now you're bringing in a whole new set. So really looking at this as an opportunity to educate them and to see the long-term impacts of those areas. I think you can, for some of the newer grantees, I would highly recommend talking to some of the veteran grantees that are here today. They can really show you and talk through the impacts of building to certain standards. I know I don't see anyone in here, but I know the state of Louisiana has some very great examples of building to certain standards and seeing the way that they are able to survive category 4 hurricane or some, and that really shows long-term, resilience and really the impacts of the dollars you're investing. So the other is broadband, as everything is wireless, you do everything on your phone, you're doing everything here, there, everywhere. Previously, it was, really encouraged where you could at eligible costs, you can put broadband in. Hey, this is a great idea, especially if we're building different buildings or structures. But now, hey, we're going to require it. Like that is, if you can imagine being in this room and not having any wireless, how, we have an entire group, and I think it's, as Tina said this morning, very large, almost like 800 plus people that are virtually listening into this, right? So understanding the importance of really broadband and accessibility as a basic of our communities, particularly our vulnerable communities that you're assisting in your recovery. So requiring that it is, you must do it 4 units or more. You're putting in broadband, you're setting up that infrastructure for them to be successful and for them to really be a more resilient community. So just going through a couple of other changes here. And highlighting this, hopefully this chart is helpful, something you can reference back. Homeownership assistance, obviously that is a long-term fundamental goal of HUD. It is also a goal to increase, the community that is recovering. So in the annual program, you can assist. Many programs have sometimes you use CDBG, sometimes you're using home for your down payment assistance or homeownership assistance. You can provide in the CDBG world at 50%. DR is 100%. So you can really look at how do you increase home ownership in that community as you recover. The safe housing incentive. So this is a new initiative, and this is a little bit, harder, and it's a harder conversation, and it's a conversation a lot of grantees will likely have to have with their communities. There are some very vulnerable communities that are hit repeatedly by disasters, and it's just really not safe for them to live there. But that's also their home. That's where they know. That is really what they want. They want to go back there, right? They've lived there their whole lives. Really, in the consolidated notice, it starts to give the push and the discussion of having that tough discussion of really encouraging households to relocate to suitable housing in a lower risk area. So that may be moving inland in a, disaster, if it's a coastal area, determining what is, where you can, moving inland and out of a high fire area, out of a repeated tornado alley or area that's been hit. So that's really critical. It is a tough conversation, but it is a conversation to begin to have as you start to have the conversations with stakeholders and your community. What is the long-term goal and recovery of this community look like? Then acquisition of second homes. This has been, this has been one that has gone back and forth and always has a question when it comes into disaster recovery. The annual program is not allowed. In disaster recovery, this is a new piece from the consolidated notice. This is an option on the table for that post-disaster fair market value. So previously, it was it was something that was not allowed based in the previous Federal Register notice. It is. I think there's a lot that goes around this depending on your community and the needs of your community. So considering this a pretty heavy discussion hand as you look through it. And then rental housing. So grantees, if you're constructing rental housing, 5 or more units, you are, really HUD is building a parallel to your home partners, and using those standards to ensure that the affordability is that you're looking at that affordability period. And that really says that, hey, your minimum affordability period is 20 years, right? I think thinking about that. That is something to consider if you've read the consolidated notice, that there's 6 years in your grant expenditure, right? And we're saying you have to be affordable for 20. So really what we're saying here is that your agency, or if you are choosing as you're building rental housing, which we know is a need in so many communities, that this is really a long-term investment beyond the recovery of the disaster to ensure affordable housing has a place in the community. So making sure you consider that as you're looking at it, that there has to be someone that you're tracking that affordability for the next 20 years. Many of if you have a home grant or you have a home allocation or you have other affordable housing, probably have a department that's handling that and can coordinate with them. So again, thinking about this from the beginning, right? You're building codes, discussing it with long-term affordability, making sure that you're really making those connections in your community and with your agency and or other departments to make sure that this is successful. And finally, economic revitalization. This is likely, one that many grantees on the annual side, we see some economic revitalization depending on the community and what they're looking at. However, when we look at disaster recovery, this really does, come back full circle to say, okay, if we have businesses that were completely washed out or completely burned, how do we really help them come back? And what type of businesses are we looking to assist, right? If we have a whole community that's lost its economic viability, how do we ensure that it is coming back? Because we know that for people to live somewhere, they need places to go shop. They need a bank they need all of those amenities to make that program do and that housing, that community work. So in the annual program, right, the use of CDBG is 50, you cannot exceed 50,000 per full-time equivalent job, right? That public benefit standard. However, in disaster recovery, we know that there are a handful of different types of economic revitalization that you may be looking at, different types of industries, different types of businesses. So that is waived, and you'll be looking to, it's not, explaining that as you are developing your program, what does that look like? What is your public benefit standard? What are you doing as you create your programs? And then under the consolidated notice, when we talk about the LMI jobs, you're looking at tracking, initially you think, okay, if I'm creating a job, I'm tracking that person that's being employed in that one position and, all of their information. You can look at what HUD says is okay. We understand that there may be industries and there may be different areas that we were holistically recovering, right? Maybe it was an area that had some tourism, that had maybe some shops and some different restaurants or different items, different, industries. You can look at that and say, based on the business, the type of job, the annual wages, this is what meets the LMI job, right? So you can look at it a little bit more holistically to be able to create a benefit, looking at that national objective to create those jobs by industry and not necessarily by individual. So you get to really look, you're still looking at the individuals that are employed, right? But you are looking at it based on the salaries of the jobs that are offered. So you have a little bit more flexibility and a little bit more expansiveness to be able to look at that economic revitalization, because it's such a key portion of the recovery of a community.
All right. So like we mentioned before, incorporating things like the green building standards in your building codes, thinking about how you build in a more resilient manner as you're recovering, implementing these DR dollars, right? HUD is encouraging folks across their DR allocation to not just put back what was there, right? But do it better. So hopefully the next time around, you don't need the recovery, knock on wood, right? Previously, HUD has also had a separate allocation for CDBG mitigation dollars. Some of y'all might have received those allocations. But through the consolidated notice, HUD has shifted a little bit and morphed that allocation into a set aside within your DR allocation. So we're going to dig into that just a little bit. So if you're receiving a more recent allocation, instead of being eligible for that CDBG MIT allocation separate from DR, right? HUD has incorporated a 15% mitigation set aside into your DR funds. So just like with the original CDBG mitigation allocations, you don't need a tie back to justify your mitigation projects, right? So I think that can certainly be handy. Like Adrian said as well, right? As we get further from a disaster, sometimes those tiebacks are harder and harder to connect. But I think it's also key to think of this mitigation set aside as, when possible, a complement to your DR funds, right? So if you're tackling a buyout program and in it you decide to purchase properties that don't necessarily have damage from the disaster, but are in a vulnerable area, right? And buying out the entire geography, whatever that is, right, will make people safer. That's incorporating those mitigation concepts and benefits into your DR programming. And you're able to do that, which is great. On the flip side, if you identify a project that is critical for your community, for that long-term resilience, for that long-term mitigation, but tying it back to the storm or the fire just isn't feasible, you've got that 15% set aside to access for that project. So I think incorporating mitigation funds as the set aside encourages that holistic approach to how you are tackling your recovery, and encourages you to incorporate those mitigation goals and impacts, right, into each project and program. But you've also got the flexibility of the mitigation dollars on their own within that 15% cap, right, when needed. Just like with the original mitigation allocations, HUD is also really encouraging you to leverage these dollars with other funding opportunities, funding through FEMA, funding through the Army Corps of Engineers, funding with the U.S. Forest Service, whatever it is, right? Tying these dollars, these mitigation dollars, onto those other programs that historically also target mitigation strategies will allow you to do more with the set aside that you have access to, right? So again, in these early planning stages, thinking big picture, thinking and identifying what else is happening in your community with some of these other funding sources, and then seeing how you can tag in your mitigation funds when possible to have those projects go further and have the impacts be more lasting. But it hasn't changed the mitigation requirements. So if you're looking at a mitigation project, right, you've got these 3 requirements that still have to be met. Of course, you're meeting an eligible activity with access to those flexibilities that Adrian just walked through. To be addressing a need that's been identified in your mitigation needs assessment, right? So making those connections, everything comes out of your action plan, comes out of that early planning. You're setting the stage to say, here are our needs, here's where we are, and this is how we're going to move forward. And then those mitigation projects have to meet that original definition of mitigation. So always returning to that definition instead of the tieback, right? To say, this is how our project fits into this mitigation scope.
So to round out our conversation this morning, before we open it up for questions, and we're throwing a lot of the fundamentals to all of you this morning to really create that basis. We're going to talk about duplication of benefits. And before I jump in onto duplication of benefits, I will say there is an entire hour dedicated to DOB for later on in the week that can really go into those questions, because I know that is the number one questions probably that will be asked around that wonderful duplication of benefits world this week. So everyone, if you are new to disaster recovery and you're like, and this is the first you are hearing of duplication of benefits, welcome to the club. You will be hearing about it for the rest of the week. And you will be, this is the core piece. This comes from the Stafford Act. So it is, as you'll hear from your HUD folks, this is something that, this is given to HUD from the Stafford Act. This is not something that HUD has the ability to waive. As we talked about waivers and alternative requirements earlier, it is there. What it says is that in essence, as we're going in, is that the federal government does not like to pay for things twice. So if you have received funding for the same activity from another source, such as FEMA or SBA or a private source, HUD is not going to pay for that item again. Now, if you can imagine, as we talked about this morning, and when we kicked off this presentation, this was the very high level. So there could be hours of conversation on what funding for the same purpose is. There are separate Federal Register notices about it. There is a ton of guidance on it as you define what that is. But the big piece is that, as Tennille talked about this morning, all of the data, the data agreements and everything that you are connecting with, and you're probably maybe in the painful process of getting all of those wrapped up, will allow you to access as a grantee to understand, hey, where is the FEMA data? How do I see what people have received from FEMA? How do I see what has been received from SBA, the Small Business Association? What has someone received in insurance for to repair their home, right? All of those are key DOB sources. And then really understanding HUD is here to pay for that unmet need, right? That last unmet need piece that still remains after all of that other funding is in place. So there is, a ton of detail here. And the key piece is ensuring that as you set up your programs, every single program, not just housing, right? The logical place of DOB is housing because of that FEMA IA assistance, SBA, insurance. So you have a very standard duplication of benefit process that flows. However, DOB is for every single dollar that touches disaster recovery dollar. So that means if you have a small business program and those small businesses receive funding from SBA, if you have a infrastructure program and what funding was received from FEMA. So really understanding that it's not just in your individual, your beneficiary programs, person to person, right? It is across every program, and you need to ensure that you've checked. So it is really, it's duplicative if it is funding from the same source. So if it is funding for the same item of recovery, right? Insurance for home, the structure of the home, HUD isn't paying for the content. So it's really understanding what is duplicative and how does each program assess where that duplicative assistance is. So really setting that up and understanding that all entities are subject to that analysis, whether it's state or government, whether you're providing funding to your public works department to complete a drainage project, you're assessing if there have been other funds for the same purpose. So setting up that process on the front end, on the application, on an approval, all of those pieces are really critical on the front side of things. And I am going to say we are going to kind of wrap DOB right there because there's further opportunities to discuss, because I guarantee you, if you have delved anywhere into your disaster recovery, there are specific questions that you have that we can look at in some of the follow-up sessions. The last piece on DOB that I will touch on is the DRRA, or the Disaster Recovery Reform Act, that was issued in 2019. The big piece here, and I know it will be quite the hot topic and discussion, is the treatment of loans under the Stafford Act and how loans are considered duplication of benefits. This was this was a congressional decision, and that the loans under the Stafford Act from January 1 to 2016 to December 31st of 2021 are no longer DOB. So if certain conditions are met, depending on what the loan is for. So this obviously impacts dramatically across the board in terms of DOB and in terms of the ability to potentially provide a loan that could not be considered DOB. However, so that really only applies to 2015 to 2021. So if you were an old veteran grantee, this is not for you, but if you're someone, and if you are the 22 class, this obviously sunset, the requirement was through 2021. And the bigger piece is that this sunsets on October 5th of 2023. So I know there are a few grantees in the room that are actively looking, very detailed through the DRRA, what is possible, how can you have the maximum flexibility. So I anticipate a lot of additional conversation around this over the next few days, peer-to-peer or with the HUD partners. All right, guys. And I think we're just about at time. Sorry, best laid plans to be quick. And here we go, digging into everything. Time flies. Wrapping it all up together. When you're starting your initial planning, you're thinking through how you're going to address your unmet need. Your activities need to be a national objective. They've got to be an eligible activity, and they have to have a time back unless you're targeting mitigation specific projects, right? Those have to meet the definition of mitigation. Using those as your guidepost to say, all right, how are we going to deal with these dollars and make some impacts? And then using your federal register notice, for you new folks, the consolidated notice as your guidebook, right? It has the processes, the procedures, the rules, the regulations, all of those details you need to understand how you take those three core principles and apply them in a way that makes the most sense for the community. Again, always remembering to rely on your resources, to call in HUD when you've got questions, when you may need additional flexibilities, and then to pull in your team early. Like Adrian said, your finance folks, other departments, whoever it is, partner agencies who are targeting the same types of response, figuring out how you collaborate to have a comprehensive recovery is the best way to get started. So I think with that, we're going to potentially hold Q&A for the breakout session or the session after. Yeah. Yes. Thank you so much for doing back to basics fundamentals. In 15 minutes, we're going to be doing back to basics, action plans, notifications, and program launch. So questions that you get to now, and we'll have broken for 15 minutes. If you're coming back to this room, we can get to those questions. So thank you. And thank you to our presenters.